Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? Please welcome the CEO of the Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Hello, it's great to see you. My name is Karen Tucker. I'm the CEO at the Churchill Club, and tonight we welcome three very important members of the Google search team, Matt Cutts, Ben Gomes, and Amit Singhal. And it's rare indeed that the three of them would appear to speak publicly together. In fact, this is the first time that this has occurred. And so I guess it's quite an historic moment and very fitting that here we are in the Computer History Museum to witness this. And we also have Danny Sullivan from Search Engine Land here to guide the conversation. Thank you all very much for being here. I also want to thank Google for their support in making this program possible. When we asked, they stepped up to help, and that means a lot. So let's give them a round of applause to thank them. It's traditional to announce our next couple of programs. We proudly present our next two programs as the finale of our 25th anniversary celebration year. We kicked it off last October with a remarkable conversation between technologist and filmmaker James Cameron and Eric Schmidt. And now we'll cap it off on September 15 and 16 with the inaugural Churchill Club Awards. And the Churchills recognize excellence in order to inspire others in the areas of innovation, social benefit, collaboration, and leadership, which are all essential ingredients of our unique innovation ecosystem here or an innovation community anywhere. The four awards are Game Changer, Global Benefactor, Magical Team, and Legendary Leader. Jeffrey Moore will officiate as our Master of Ceremonies. This is the evening of Thursday, September 15 in Santa Clara. Part 2 takes place the following day on Friday, September 16, held in the same location. It's called Igniting Innovation and Mastering Change, a day-long conversation in 3 acts. It's about the freshest thinking and perspectives on innovation and change in Silicon Valley, the nation, the world. We'll build on discussions that have taken place elsewhere and end with an inspiring view of the future, as well as, of course, if you like, a cocktail. And also very important, Churchill Club is a member-supported nonprofit organization dedicated to encouraging innovation and economic growth. And if you're not a member, please consider joining us, our amazing group of members, and take advantage of the many benefits that we offer. You can find out more about that on our website at churchillclub.org, and also including a list of this year's Churchill Awards winners. So thank you for that. My final announcement is if you are tweeting tonight, please use #Churchill Club. And our moderator, Danny Sullivan, is editor-in-chief of Search Engine Land. Danny has covered search engines since 1995 and interviewed many industry leaders, to name a few: Sergey Brin, Eric Schmidt, Jerry Yang, Steve Ballmer, Barry Diller. You can read all about his impressive accomplishments in his official bio, but what you won't find there is that Danny generally ends his workday with a rollerblade along the boardwalk in Newport Beach, regularly tweeting a picture of the setting sun. So my thought is perhaps that unwinding and reflective time is one of the secrets that made him one of the most respected authorities on search engines today. Please give your warmest welcome to Danny Sullivan.
I live on a peninsula down in Newport Beach, and it's always funny when I'm up here because people say, "Are you from the peninsula?" And I'll say yes, and then I realize they're talking about a completely different place, so we're interchanging. It's a real pleasure to be here and talking and doing a panel for the Churchill Club. We've been talking about doing some kind of a session about search for just over about a year, and when it got closer and we came up with some ideas, this panel really came about from Steven Levy's excellent book in the Plex. If you haven't read it, my short review is go read it. Not now, but maybe in about an hour and a half. And engineer David Bailey is quoted as being assigned to work in an office at Google, and he's supposed to be working in this office with Amit Singhal, Ben Gomes, and Matt Cutts, and he says it's definitely the cool kid's office. And that really struck me when I read that, because I'd been to this office many times over the years. I typically would go into Google and have a day's worth of briefings. And then at the end of the day, I'd usually end up talking to Matt on webmaster issues, and we would be in this office, and it would kind of turn into this search bowl session, which is a lot of fun to hear all of them interacting about, well, maybe the result should be this way or this particular issue. So this kind of session is kind of bringing that office to life and some of the things that go on with it. If I had to describe the areas that each of these men oversee, when it comes to search, Amit would be the brains, and Ben would be the looks, and Matt would be the brawn. So I hope you're happy with your choices in life. Amit oversees the ranking algorithm at Google, how Google decides what content should be shown in response to searches that happen. Ben oversees features that help you search better, as well as the user interface look that lets you interact with Google search. And Matt's the bouncer. He's the chief of police, the person in charge of keeping the people who would spam and pollute and harm Google search results and bring disorder there under control. And they're each going to tell you a little bit more about themselves. We'll start with Amit, because he's the baby of the group, having been at Google for only 10.5 years.
Thank you, Danny. So what Danny is referring to is the fact that of the 3 Googlers you are seeing up here, I joined Google last. These 2 were already there, and I've been there 10.5 years in a 12.5-year-old Google. So that's the composition of the office. We have been there for 10.5 years together, 11.5, and somewhere in there for Matt. And we have worked together since the day I arrived. I have had a fairly long academic background before I arrived at Google. I got a master's in search and then a PhD in search. Yes, there is such a thing. And this is back when it was the sleepy field that librarians used to study. And what computer scientists thought that really wasn't the prestigious thing to do, operating systems or compilers were. And this is all geek talk. Yeah. And I ended up getting a PhD in search and went to AT&T Bell Labs, which became AT&T Labs, to pursue an academic career, and published a lot of papers and so on about search. And then in 1999, my good friend Krishna Bharat, who is father of Google News, in a conference over beers told me that he's going to this company called Google in 1999. And Krishna was single then, just to give you some color on the conversation. And I and my lovely wife Shilpa was sitting there. We had one child and the second one on the way. And I said, Krishna, Google what? It's like, you're single, you can afford to do this. Google schmoogle's all gonna die. I have a family to feed. I work for AT&T. And next year, I was here, working with Krishna and these wonderful people, and the rest is indeed history. Ben.
So I think the common thread is Krishna, because I went to high school with Krishna, and we both had chemistry labs at home, and that was our common love, actually, doing chemistry experiments. Now, this is something that both of us being brown-skinned boys don't do in this country anymore. But that was our common thread that we brought from, that our common interest from a long time ago, and both of us went into computer science. And then when we came, he told me he'd interviewed at Google and there were lots of sharp people there, and it seemed like a fun place to work. I was like, sure, why not interview there too? And so I interviewed there, I got the job, and I remember my boss at Sun asked me, he said, do you think Google is ever going to be 1/10 the size of Alta Vista? I was like, I'm not sure, but it looks like a fun place to work. And his boss made fun of me in the group meeting saying, you're going to work for a company that has an exclamation mark in their name. Because Google, if you remember, used to have an exclamation mark. And both of them now work at Google. So, it ended up being, and the scuttlebutt in the valley at the time was Google had a secret plan because clearly it wasn't search. These are smart guys. There's no business in search. And so I remember when I first joined Google, I asked Urs, who was my boss at the time, Urs Hosler, the VP of engineering, so what really is Google's plan? And when he told me it's search, I was so disappointed. It turned out to work out okay, though.
Absolutely. Hey, everybody. My name is Matt, and I was actually a computer graphics guy. I was working on my PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and yeah, woo, represent a couple to go Tar Heels, and got a job offer to go work for Google in 1999. And my girlfriend at the time said, well, that sounds like a really good opportunity, but you know, I'm not willing to move all the way across the country without a wedding ring. So we actually eloped and drove across the country, took a quick honeymoon, showed up, and the very first project that I got at Google came about because my manager stopped at my cubicle and said, Matt, how do you feel about porn? And I said, well, it depends. Why are you asking exactly? And so they wanted me to write a family-safe version of Google, which is called Safe Search. So I wrote the first version of that. And in the process of doing that, I found out that there are bad people on the internet. And so for the last 10 or 11 years, I've been dealing with bad people on the internet. And of course, there's a huge number of good people as well, but that's been a lot of what I work on.
And Matt has a cornfield that he can wish those bad people into. You don't want to be one of them. We're going to dive into some questions, just a really bit of background, just to kind of set the stage on some of the technical stuff. It won't be that much of a technical issue, but you know, search engines, to the essential pieces of them, there is a crawler that goes out and finds pages from all over the web and stores the content that this crawler finds in what we call an index. It's like a big book of the web. And the crawler is constantly updating this index, keeping all the pages fresh. Some of them it visits a lot, maybe every few hours, maybe every few minutes, depending on how frequent that page. Some it goes back as it needs to. Your personal blog, maybe it only needs to drop by once a month. When all that stuff is put into this index and we come along and we do our searches, that's where the search algorithm kicks in. And it goes and it flips through that giant book, if you will, and it finds all the pages that it thinks are most relevant and should be shown in response to a search. Now, for me and for others, when you talk about what an ideal search engine should be, and this is how the big search engines have generally operated, they're akin to being a newspaper. You have editorial content that is supposed to represent what somebody feels is sort of a fair, sort of a representation, some of the best kind of stuff that they can put together that is being shown to you independent of any advertising influences or any sponsorship that's going on out there. You know, you can get ads, but they go off to the side just like you might get in a regular newspaper. If you follow through with the newspaper metaphor, search engines have a much more incredibly hard job than a search engine newspaper. A newspaper will assemble this content each day. They're in their office building. Maybe they're getting phone calls that come in. They're getting story tips or whatever. For a search engine, it's as if they're in the middle of Times Square, and they are surrounded by people shouting things at them, saying, I got a great story for you. I got a great story for you. And some of those are great ideas, but the people don't shout very loudly, and you need to kind of hear better and bring them forward. Some of them shout very loud, and they're terrible ideas. And some people are just purposely being misleading. And in the midst of all this, you have people who are literally just dumping garbage all around where you're working, just junk all over the place. So go out there and come up with some good search listings off of that. With that kind of background, all these things going on, people actively trying to mislead you, people who just don't even understand that when they rendered their entire website built out of, say, Flash, it was kind of hard to read. How do you figure out who to trust, who not to trust? How do you go about that core part of the job, coming up with the right listings?
So that's a great summary of how search engines operate, Danny. And imagine you have a book with billions and billions and billions and billions of pages. You do have an index like you have at the end of a book, which says which word appears where. And that's the index, a very similar index that most search engines, including ourselves, build. Now, when you type a query into Google, you give us a few words, and we use that index to find the few most relevant pages for your 2.5, 3-word query. And this is clearly a deeply scientific process. It's incredibly hard as a science, has been studied as an academic field for over 40 years. And at its heart, there are simple heuristics, simple heuristics like if you said Danny as your query, then a page that contains the word Danny many times is probably more relevant than the page that contains Danny just once. That's the first simple principle of search. And then there are other principles like words like the are not very important, so don't use them as boldly as you would use a word like Danny. And you take such simple principles of how language behaves, and you build algorithms based on those principles in an environment that's the modern web. And that's where the basic description of a search algorithm. Now, clearly in the real world, everyone wants to come up number one for the query Danny Sullivan, and therefore they give us pages which say Danny Sullivan 1,000 times, whereas Danny is so polite, he only uses his name once or twice on his website. So in the real world, all these assumptions, all these principles are challenged like we are fighting through all this complexity to get you Danny's page, which we do get out there. So that's roughly how it works. So we have taken simple principles of how language behaves and coded it into algorithms to return to you what we believe are the most relevant pages on the web. That's the voice of the web according to our algorithms.
And in the same way that all good things in moderation, according to the ancient proverb, the first time or two you see Danny Sullivan, that's great. But if you see it a whole bunch, then it starts to turn a lot worse. And so you have to realize that the web is like a giant torture test. People will do crazy things on the web. Any program you write to parse a web page will break by the time you get web pages that are long, that are complicated, people don't close their tables, and also malicious or deceptive people. And so you have to worry about not just ambiguity, like there's a Danny Sullivan who's a race car driver, turns out, but also just people who want to rank for everything. And so it is a really difficult problem, but through those sorts of principles, those computer programs, those algorithms, rather than having a single person saying, I think this ought to be number one, or I like this result for that, it's much more scalable to have the computer programs and say, okay, they can work 24/7, they don't have to sleep, it tends to work a lot better in different languages, all those sorts of things.
And I think one of the early insights that Google had was that the link structure of the web was going to be really useful for this. And so the PageRank algorithm, which was at the heart of Google's early search was actually fundamentally leveraging the link structure of the web to actually find out which is the real Danny Sullivan, in addition to all the other things that we were doing.
Yeah, so you can imagine when you're going on the web and someone says, click here to go to Danny Sullivan's homepage, that link, hyperlink as we call it, is a tiny recommendation for Danny. And we take these people's voices, which are encoded on these web pages as links, and we have built an algorithm to actually harness the power of the web, these voices of authors who have built this web to build what's Google today.
Now, the links especially were the big claim to fame when Google came along. I mean, people had been using links, but you really took it up to a new level. And suddenly you could find this needle in the million-page haystack that was happening. And over this period, if you go back to, say, 2000, it's largely what I'd say is sort of the Google decade. You know, you were this unquestioned leader when it came to search, and that was the gold standard. And then towards the end of last year and through this year, it's been really amazing the amount of attention that's been focused on search quality. We had the sunglasses merchant who the New York Times profiled because he was convinced that because he was such a rotten merchant that all the bad reviews were giving him links that helped him do better. We had complaints that people were saying that, wow, I've written this content, somebody has simply copied it or scraped it and put it on their own website, and now they're outranking me. I'm the originator, you're not finding my original content. There were concerns that what's been dubbed content farms. I won't get into the debate about what those are, but people were concerned that there were these content farm things and they were flooding Google with low-quality listings. And then suddenly it seemed like there was this turn that, oh, well, Google is just terrible and all your results are junk. And you've reacted to that with a series of updates and a series of changes. The merchant prompted this unprecedented 5-day shift in your algorithm that I'd never seen happen so quickly. You've had other updates on the scrapers. Probably the most talked about thing had been this Panda update. Google often gives nicknames to when they make these algorithm changes. The most recent algorithm change they had was nicknamed Panda. And so you're making these changes. How do you decide what's broken, how to fix it, and assess whether or not your fixes are working?
So this is a very good question. And the heart of Danny's question is, how do you decide if I should change my algorithm in this direction, and is that the right change or not? And what we do at Google is that we have a few principles on which we operate this search team. And the first and the foremost principle that we have put in place is do what's best for the user. And once you use that principle and develop science, then to measure what's best for the user to the best of scientists' ability. You know, I've been a scientist in this field for 20 years. Ben and Matt have worked here for almost a dozen now. So what we have done internally is developed very rigorous scientific methodology to evaluate if turning our algorithm right is a good thing or turning it left is a good thing, and by how much is it going to do a good thing for the users or not. And it would be really good to set up the context of the team, how we operate. Let me just use a very, very simple example of how search progresses. And I'm going to use a dumb example to just prove a point. Suppose one day an engineer walks up to me and says, Amit, I'm going to promote all pages that have pink background. Matt says, no, blue background's better, okay? So now what does this engineer do with this idea? The engineer goes and writes an algorithm that incorporates his or her idea, which either promotes pink pages or promotes blue pages, depending on who won the argument in our office. Okay, that's usually Matt. And then that algorithm is unleashed in a sandbox, which we have of the entire web inside our offices, not really in our offices, they are in data centers, but only available to our engineers. No users are subjected to that sandbox. And the engineer runs this blue page promotion idea in the sandbox. So the new algorithm is blue page rank higher, other page rank lower. Now you have the new algorithm and the current algorithm, the two ranking systems. We take these two ranking systems and put them through amazingly rigorous testing. Rigorous testing involves things like we will take hundreds and thousands of queries from our past logs, run the old algorithm, run the new algorithm. We will show it to an independent human being outside who doesn't even know what algorithm is being tested. And sometimes we do this on them so that they don't develop a favorite, left or right, okay? And computers keep track of whether left was the new or the right was the new. And statistically, after you have run thousands of queries through this left-right blind test, first number emerges that says, no, promoting blue pages is not such a great idea, Matt.
Sorry.
Okay.
There's a thought, you know.
So there we go, right? Now that's the first test you have to pass. Once you have passed that level of testing, we take a tiny subset of our live traffic and we take this algorithm and we put it outside in a real data center where users are doing their queries. And we take a very, very tiny subset of our live traffic coming into that data center and subject it to this new algorithm if it was good. The blue one didn't make it to live testing. And if users are now liking the new algorithm, where their liking is described by they are clicking much higher in the ranks in that, relevant documents are ranking higher, and they are spending less time searching through results and clicking on multiple results, they find the right result quickly with speed, then the new algorithm is better. And with these tests in mind and this much statistics behind every chain, and we make about 500 changes to our algorithm every year, and we run 20,000 plus such tests every year. With this level of rigorous scientific testing, we put a statistical report together put by a statistician not related to the engineer or his or her team. That report is brought to a group of people, all three of us included, to make a decision whether this algorithm should be launched to the world or not. And in that committee, which you may have read about in Steven's books and articles, is where a whole lot of debate happens. It's not just these two numbers that will force you to launch something. There are many more considerations that go into launching a system, like, is it good for the web ecosystem at large? Would it benefit authors? Would it benefit high-quality content? Would it keep our system simple so that we can maintain it much longer? And with all these considerations put together, that committee says, yes, we should launch this or not. Hey, what did I miss?
You very good description. And there's a couple of things you might not realize. One is that there is no way to change a computer program, to change how Google ranks and scores things, that's going to be perfect, that's going to make every single query better, right? Because we get over 1 billion queries a day. And if you get hundreds of millions of queries, you could make 500 of them great and only one worse, but you're never going to make all of them better. So there's always this tension, there's always this trade-off where you're trying to have the goals of the best results for users, the best quality, helping the web ecosystem. And then there has to be room for intuition and experience. So for example, I work on spam, that's people who try to cheat. And it's definitely the case that users often click on spam because they see something that looks enticing. Oh, this is what I looked for. And so we've seen examples where one person will click on the same spammer 8 times in a row. And you just want to, how can you do that? After 7 times, you couldn't tell this was not good stuff? Right? And so by looking at just the raw clicks or just the raw statistics, it might look like this is a horrible change. So you have to take those factors into account. But absolutely, the statistics and those launch reports carry so much weight because they've built up this intuition about what are good changes and what are not as good for users.
And in some ways, this allows us to move a lot. This is essential for us moving faster, because if you don't know that you're making progress, you can constantly end up second-guessing yourself and so on. So being very rigorous is essential to our speed of moving fast. So we're constantly sure that we're doing the best thing we can for users at any given point. And we go through the same kind of rigor for interface changes too, because those are sometimes even more complex to evaluate because there are more moving parts in the system. So the live experimentation and so on, and there we augment it with user studies where we have a usability lab where we watch people use the product and make sure that it actually works in practice while watching users. But they also go to the same level of rigor for all of the interface changes that we make.
So that's a long way of saying we are in the process of scientifically determining what's the best thing for the user. This measurement in itself is a science. We are at the cutting edge of that science, and that science is evolving as well. But to the best of science's ability to predict whether a change is good for a user or not, we use that science to make changes to Google.
I'll come back in a bit to the determining of the relevancy and if you've got it right. But Matt, I want to pick up on what you mentioned on the spamming. I mean, you are in this hostile environment. In fact, what's the conference that you have? It's like information retrieval.
Yes.
You had information retrieval, which was a science where people would be like, how do we get our stuff out of the LexisNexis database nobody's mentioning? And then you have like these hostile information retrieval.
Yes, there's an entire conference called Adversarial Information Retrieval. Yeah, so it's where the goals change because the people are trying to cheat and deceive you. Yeah.
So you're in this environment. How do you measure up what's wrong? How do you prevent getting the wrong person? You just said that you've got people who will maybe click 8 times on a spam thing. You have to use some intuition, but then some people may click 8 times on the right thing. So
Sure.
how do you do that?
Absolutely. So we try to provide very clear guidelines. If you search on Google for quality guidelines, we actually have instructions for publishers and webmasters about the sorts of things that are good and the sorts of things that are not as good. And hopefully they make sense because we want to judge the same page that a user sees. And so by that principle, you shouldn't hide white text on a white background. You shouldn't show us a page about cartoons and then show hardcore porn to users. You know, things that you would think would be intuitive, right? And so what's good and bad, what's the curse, is that once you know how to see spam, you will always see spam. in any system. You'll look at the cheaters, you'll find the people, you'll recognize the people who are trying to game the system. And the nice thing is that most of the time it's very clear. Spammers tend to be lazy, and they tend to go all the way out and try to get as much traffic as possible, as quickly as possible, and that leaves some footprints and some ways that you can spot. And what's tricky is when people, get more towards that gray zone. So, for example, we have this category of stuff that we call web spam, and we have very clear guidelines. And some of the stuff that happened in the last year regarding content farms was stuff that you might consider just outside of the guidelines. They didn't necessarily keyword stuff. They didn't necessarily do something horribly bad for users, but it was still really low quality content that regular people would complain about. And so by just stepping barely outside that zone, it fell between the cracks for a little while. And the nice thing about Google is that by being in the same office, you can turn around and you can say, hey, is this your job or is this my job? Is your guy? Oh, okay, we'll tackle this. Okay, and that has worked very well. It's amazing how at Google there's also the concept of a war room. We try not to go for big warlike metaphors, but that one actually dates back a long time ago. And whenever you have a crisis, you say, okay, get everybody in the same room. And that makes such a difference for collaboration, such a difference for teamwork, because if somebody is a minute away, you might walk 3 or 4 times a day to check in with them. But if they are in the same room, or you can see through the glass walls, and our offices have glass walls at Google, you can see if they're at their desk. You can walk right over to them. You can see whether they're looking unhappy, looking at their computer. And so you can say, hey, is something broken? Do we need to fix something? And that really does make a big difference in productivity as well.
Now, we just recently, Mercury News had this article about, hey, I've been penalized by Google and I've had this big network and I didn't even know it happened. Mm-hmm. And we've gone back and forth on this before. I'm like, why don't you just tell everybody if they have a penalty? Yep. You guys will tell people if they have some penalties, but you won't tell everybody, so why not just say, hey, you know what, you're doing something bad and I will report it to you in our Google Webmaster Central system.
Absolutely. So Amit talked very well about algorithmic search, and the vast majority of what happens is all involving computer programs. My team sometimes has to take manual action, because if you type in your name and you get off-topic porn, so you write an angry email to Google and say, I would not like this porn result showing up for my name. I've never been in a porn film in my life. And we write back and we say, well, it's going to take us 6 to 9 months, and we think we might have an algorithm that might help. That's pretty discouraging. So my group is one of the very few where we actually are willing to take manual action. And so we've been trying a communication experiment this past year where if we have taken manual action, you can do what's known as a reconsideration request. So it's basically an appeal. And we will tell you whether we have taken manual action against your site or not. Now, if an algorithm is ranking your site lower, well, I'm sorry, with over 200 million domains, there's no way we can talk with every single webmaster or publisher one-on-one. We just, literally everyone at Google would have to do customer support. There would be no one left to actually run the computer programs and write new algorithms. So we think that that's a relatively good compromise in that if there has been manual action, you can now start to get information about that. You can say, here's what's different, here's what's new. Please let me back into Google. I've taken off the hidden text or whatever's involved.
And if you're logging in, it's become more broad, more of the things, but there's still some things we're not going to tell you.
Well, previously we hadn't revealed everything we knew because there are some really bad guys out there. Like Al Gore has had his website hacked.
Al Gore's bad.
Well, Al Gore's not bad, but his website has been hacked. Donald Trump has had his website hacked. And so there are a lot of really malicious people out there that will install malware, viruses, spyware, Trojans, whatever you want to call them, stuff you don't want on your computer. And you don't want to clue those folks in. So it is a tension, but we've absolutely been moving more towards transparency, as much communication as we can figure out how to do. In fact, some Google employees in this room have worked on trying to improve that process and have really done a great job of it.
Now, people not doing well in Google has sparked complaints. And in fact, people not doing well in search engines have sparked complaints since before we even had search engines. And there's been various things that have gone. The most common complaint that I've heard in my time has been, well, you're not ranking me well because you're trying to get me to buy an ad. But lately, now it seems to be that the reason that you're not ranking people is because they're all competitors to you. And that to preserve the Google monopoly, you're blocking them off. So what's the deal? You guys are wiping out competitors?
So the nice thing about working in search quality is we don't worry about ads or revenue at all. We have a very clear mission of doing what's best for the user. So that's not in our area of scope of worrying about at all.
Yeah, and so there's a clear church and state separation between search and ads. no matter how much money an advertiser pays Google, and that kind of goes into a revenue, they cannot improve their ranking. Okay? That's fundamentally how it works. And then the question that Danny poses is, hey, aren't you now putting this stuff up because I'm competing with you and you have demoted me? Where this stuff is, say, your stuff, that's what they call it. And I go back to our first principle, do what's best for the user. Our job is to give users the answers to their queries. What they asked for is what we need to answer. Now, in a most simplistic form, if the user types the query 2 plus 2, should we return a list of pages that have the words 2 plus 2 on it? Or should we say 4? What would you expect? If you were writing a search engine, what would you do? Take the next example. When someone says the query 1600 Amphitheater Parkway, Mountain View, California, would you not show them a map pinpointing exactly what they're looking for? Our job is to answer user queries, and that's what we do. Everything that we do, someone types GOOG, they are looking for what's the stock price of our company today at this point. And we return that value right out there. When you work with our first principles that it's all about the user, and our job is to answer your queries, everything else falls together in place.
And I think we think about it in terms of the time it takes you from the time you enter your query to the time you get the information you need. And it's going to be a lot faster for you to see the number 4 over there when you typed in 2 plus 2. So that is our goal, to get you to the information, the answer you need as quickly as possible. And that guides, we believe that's what's best for the user, and that guides our decision making.
And if you go to the very extreme, if someone comes to Google and types in poison control, you really want them to get the phone number for poison control as quickly as possible. So you want to get them that answer, whatever it is they're looking for.
So that gives, that gives an answer to some of the direct answers, and then you get into this issue of people saying, well, I just did a shopping search, and instead of you showing me instead of you listing a bunch of shopping search engines, you're sending me into Google Shopping or Google Product Search. So now you're just trying to keep yourself there.
This definition is actually somewhat absurd. If you look at Google Product Search that you're talking about, Danny, it takes pages out there on the web. It's just a search. It indexes them. It organizes that information better related to your task, where your task is to figure out how much does something cost, how well is it rated, should I buy this, is this merchant high quality? And Google Product Search takes information that's out there on the web, and merchants can feed it to us for free. For free. There's no charge to anyone who is in Google Product Search. They can feed us their prices, their availability, and so on. And at the same time, they can tell us what web pages they're selling that item on. So Google Product Search is just a different lens or a different interface on search that's far more effective for query at hand. And yes, indeed, we send users to that interface from where they can do their research and go to that merchant and complete their transaction.
In the end, they're still going to Amazon or whatever merchants are.
So, I think calling, you can squint at it hard enough and say, this is Google's own stuff, when the truth is, it's all the pages out there on the web and merchants out there on the web feeding us information for free.
Well, and Danny, you had actually made a really neat graphic a few years ago, because at one point, you might do a search for Tom Cruise, and then if you want a picture of Tom Cruise, you'd have to click on a tab, images. And if someone types in sunset or daffodil or roses, you might have learned over time that people actually want pictures of a sunset or daffodil or roses. And so Danny had made up a cool graphic that was like Google in 2015 with like tabs all over the place. Look for people, look for whatever. And really what people want is they just want to type something in and get something useful back out. And they don't want to have, like, which of the 32 different options of lenses do you want to search through? So,
now, if you go to, say, the purest form of a search engine, to me it's that I've done the search, I've clicked, and I've gone outbound. And so from the search engine to a destination, and that the search engine itself is not a destination. And when you talk about, like with shopping search, when I've heard these arguments, most of them don't hold up with me because I think, oh yes, Google sent you from Google to Google Shopping, wherein you still left Google Shopping and went to a destination merchant. But you get these tricky issues where Google actually hosts content and indeed becomes a destination. Cases like Google Books or Google Places, where you're aggregating and consolidating a lot of information. So if I do a search, rather than going outbound to the merchant, I may go to the places. And perhaps the best example of this is YouTube, where I do a search, maybe I'm going to get a YouTube video that's coming up, and you are a destination. So there's inherent conflicts in that. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with those conflicts?
So, we deal with our conflicts with the same first principle that we have ever had. Test, experiment, scientifically test, and make sure all your changes are good for the users. And once you have that principle in place, and you're designing your result page, because our job is to return a result page that's really, really valuable for the query, you're designing your result page and testing it extensively. Then for the query evolution of dance, you would see, yes, evolution of dance site, and yes, you will see some YouTube videos as well, because that's what the users are looking for. So we keep going back to our first principle. Whenever a conflict arises, we go back to our first principle. Is this good for our users? If it is, we will do it.
Yeah, and at the same time, it makes perfect sense. So, I remember Alta Vista used to be where you would search for a person's name like Jeff Dean, and it would say, buy Jeff Dean on eBay, right? And you couldn't really buy people on eBay, so it wasn't a very good thing for the user experience. If we were always showing something, like every single time we showed a result from Google Books, that would be really annoying. So we know it's not in Google's best interests to annoy users, to do things that are bad for users, because then they get turned off. There's plenty of other places to go and get information online.
But as these other things have expanded, have you ever thought, I wish we didn't have that, because my life would be simpler, because then I wouldn't have to deal with these kinds of questions?
No, we like your questioning, Danny. That's fine. But fundamentally, right, every time we build something, say Maps, it was the most innovative product when we launched Google Maps. The first product that allowed you to scroll the map in using Ajax technology at the time. Everyone else followed suit to the degree that now if you land at a page which has an embedded image of a map, you try scrolling it right there. So we feel proud to build these innovative products. And when we build these innovative products, then giving users answers right on the result page is absolutely the right thing to do. So clearly, our job is going back to our first principle, giving users answers to what they ask for, and sometimes we have to lean upon innovative products like Maps to answer a query.
And I think a core part of our competency is actually ranking a variety of these different information sources, right? I mean, it started with PDF. When, from the first time we started crawling PDFs in 2000, PDFs are long documents, and so they can begin to dominate all the results. And so as soon as we started crawling PDFs, we saw results full of PDFs, and so we had to deal with this issue of heterogeneous content there.
Hey,
and
how
I remember
did we deal with that?
I was working on crawling and indexing at the time, and also ranking, and then I realized, well, we just hired a world expert on ranking. Maybe I should ask him. And he had not yet even come to Mountain View, and I remember calling him up to say, Amit, you did your thesis on this stuff. What do you do? And so I remember talking to him about this. And
so Ben calls me, and he says, hey, we just started crawling PDFs, and they're long documents. They have the word over and over again. For every query, I'm seeing just PDFs. For the query IBM, I'm seeing PDF, not IBM.com. And you have written a dissertation on how to deal with varying document lengths in search systems. And I had joined Google in its New York office back in 2000. And Ben was in California. This is around late 2000. He calls me up. We were driving back home from Jersey City from having dinner at a friend's house with our 2 kids in the back, right? And my wife was driving the van. And I'm talking to him over the phone, giving him formulas that basically solve the document length problem. And at the same time, trying to keep the kids quiet, take it easy, guys. It'll be okay, it's fine, right? to the degree that we didn't pay attention to what was happening to the car and we ran out of gas and had to call a tow truck.
So maybe focus matters a lot
Yeah.
whenever you're trying to figure out these apples and oranges and how to blend. Yeah.
Matt, you alluded to this earlier, but you don't manually control the rankings. If there's results that are showing up there, it's all down to the algorithm, with the exception of a tiny little experiment that we won't get into right now. But you just haven't done that, so things show up. And there have been times when, you know, the best example, I think, was one of the first examples where you would do a search for Jew, and you got this site called Jew Watch that came up that was a sort of a hate site. And people were like, how can you allow this? And in the end, you left it up. And this goes on all the time. There are these things here that a lot of people would have a consensus of saying, this sucks. You shouldn't be listing that. Why don't you take it out? So why don't you take it out?
So let me take that, right? Danny is referring to a principle that we have held dear to us in our search team, which is that we would not manually promote, demote, or remove results, even if our judgment is saying our algorithms are doing the wrong thing. The extreme case in point was query Jew. When someone did that query, it made all of us tremendously sad to see our algorithms fail by putting an anti-Semitic site at number one. We were in pain. We were really, really hurt by this. This is not what our principles are as individuals, as a team, as a company. And people said, why don't you just blacklist that site and get rid of it? However, we said, no, it's our algorithms going wrong, and we will find a solution to this algorithmic problem by algorithms, because this judgment was so clear-cut in this case that everyone's instinct would be to go blacklist that site. But in real world, not everything is such black and white. There are lots of slippery slopes. There have been many other queries where various interested parties have wanted us to shoot results out of Google's search result. And another one such query is Scientology, where we have both perspective return in our top 2 or 3 results, and clearly one group doesn't want the other perspective to be there. If we start intervening manually, first of all, we would make such arbitrary judgments. Number 2, we may paper over one hole in our algorithm, which would not fix similar problems in many more queries that our algorithm may be causing, and in many more languages that we don't even read. So our principle that we have held near and dear to our heart is, we let our algorithms reflect the voice of the web, and sometimes our algorithms will be imperfect, and we'll work hard to make them better and better. But our subjective judgment, though mostly right, is not always the right thing. And that principle has actually served us well over the last 10 years of us doing that. And that is reflected in our users coming back to Google and liking what we do.
And I think that's a principle that's come down from Larry and Sergey. In fact, with the query Jew, shortly after the problem arose, Sergey said, we will not be changing this. And then the web changed, and actually the ranking changed around. And he came back and he yelled, it's like, why did you change? And he's like, well, no, we didn't change anything. The web did change briefly, and then it flipped back again. But over time, the algorithms have gradually improved to get rid of most of those sorts of problems. And then the side effect of that actually, like you referred to briefly, is that we have been very good in languages we don't even speak, because we've relied so much on algorithmic approaches. Because otherwise, we'd have to do the same thing in every language in every country that we're in, and that's an impossible task. A consequence of taking this algorithmic approach is that we can then be excellent in small languages, in languages that otherwise are not considered maybe that important, and it just works across the world.
Yeah, I mean, a normal company would set their priorities based on revenue in a language. We don't pay attention to that. We say our job is to serve every query everywhere, in every language, whether it's in Swahili or in Hindi or in English, of course. And this algorithmic approach allows us to dish the best results for English, but the same algorithm, since languages are not that different in general, when you dive deeper, there are lots of differences that I'll not go into right now. But that algorithmic approach, then any algorithmic improvement made in English not only serves English, it serves Japanese, Swahili, Hindi, you name it, and the entire search system in this world gets better. And we feel proud to have had this principle.
I'm sweating because I've got 5 questions and 10 minutes to get them in. So we're going to lightning round.
All right.
So you've got also listings that have impacts on people. Rick Santorum would probably be very happy if you could make an algorithm change for searches on his name. But you can argue, well, he's a public figure, did certain things, upset other people, maybe, that's just what happens. But you've got people who are not public figures, who are not known in any way, do searches on, say, their names, and they go, I can't believe this thing's coming up, and it needs to go away, this is terrible. So why not let them take that stuff out? And
it's a tough call because it's a slippery slope, right? Whenever you're faced with a he said, she said sort of situation, you really don't have the time or the staffing or the judgment to be able to make the right call in every single situation. So normally we say, look, Google is attempting to be a reflection of the web, right? If there's someone who's important in real life, we want to reflect that on the web. And if someone is libeling you in real life, you can either send them a cease and desist, you can get a court case, there's lots of ways to take care of that. And online, there's lots of great ways to get your message out. You can start a blog, you can tweet, you can be on Facebook. So there's many, many ways where you can have other search results that can show up rather than just this one negative search result. But at the same time, I would say we feel the responsibility because we hear complaints, we hear people who are unhappy, and it's safe to say with so many users and so many queries, there's always someone who's unhappy, or there's always someone who can point out a really bad search result. And so I can't speak for these guys, but a lot of the times I go to bed at night thinking about how could I fix that problem, right? Or you spend that time in the shower, thinking, okay, how is that going to get fixed? But as long as you have hundreds of people behind the curtain who are thinking about how to improve search quality on all those different dimensions, then in general it tends to go pretty well.
Let me just briefly add, right? We have spent a substantial amount of our careers devoted to search, as students of search, as devotees of search. And we think day in and day out about search and how to make it better. If someone is seeing some content about them that they don't like, we heard. But then there is that case when you are searching on a doctor who you learn had his license revoked 3 times. Surely that doctor doesn't like that result. But our responsibility is bigger than that. And that's the principle we operate under.
Because it always comes back to the user. What is in the best interest of the user?
Now, I talked earlier that you've had these attacks on relevancy and you've got to improve things and you've made these sorts of changes. But one of the changes, and it's not even new, you've done it for a couple years, to try to increase the relevancy of results has been to personalize things. So where someone is based out of, if you're doing a search here versus down south, you're going to see maybe slightly different results. Your search history, the kinds of things you search on sites you've been, can come in and influence it. So we have these personalized results. And now you've got people like Eli Pariser and his filter bubble saying, well, this is terrible because now you're just showing us things we all like and we're not getting the diversity. So, what's your reaction to that? Do we have this kind of a bubble? Should there just be normal results for everybody? Is this a harmful type of thing?
So you can just imagine a normal result for searching for a restaurant in Newport Beach would be all New York City restaurants. Okay? That would be a normal result because by population and masses and consumption and usage, that's probably what wins out. So we do personalized results, and there are cases like restaurants where we personalize them tremendously, or whether we personalize weather results to where you are. And there are other cases like the query banks. Guess what? If I started returning Lloyd's Bank in the US, you guys won't be very happy. Or if I return Bank of America in the UK, they'll say something snarky about us. So there is that level of personalization which makes results tremendously relevant. And then the type of personalization that Eli's filter bubble talks about is the view personalization, that I'm just getting my view in first. And the truth in search is that we are returning relevant results, but our algorithms are so finely balanced to return some relevant results for you and some results that have the opposing point of view, as you have seen time and time again with the controversies that we just talked about, that our algorithms are tremendously balanced to give you a mix of what you want and what the world voice says you should at least know. I can give you a personal example, the query lords. You guys are thinking Dungeons and Dragons and swords and whatnot, but I'm an Indian who loves cricket, okay? And there's this cricket ground in London, the Lords. For me, that's the first result. However, all the swords and Dungeons and Dragons are right there, number 2 and 3, and that's, I would say, is an ideal page for me.
Cool. I'll go with you on that. Speak a little cricket. I'm going through a Sophie's choice of which question to throw away. You don't. You all go. I got 2, and then we'll go into the Q&A. We should make it fit. So we all not only have personalization of results, we have socialization of results, and which is sort of a subset of that personal, who you know, who you're friends with, and so on. You've been using social search for about 2 years now and having that influence things, but now you have your own social network. So how is that going to have an impact, in particular Google Plus and the +1 system on the search results that people are seeing?
That's a very good question. So Google was a pioneer in launching social search. We were the first one to launch it. We are based upon who you know. We can bring their recommendations to right top of your search results sometimes, or we can just bring them to your attention. And this is great, because if I'm searching for a plumber or a locksmith, I would much rather have these businesses reviewed by one of you who I trust, as opposed to the New York Times Square problem of everyone yelling, I'm the best locksmith, please hire me. So social search is a great advance in search technology. And social search is based upon who knows who and who knows about what. And when you put these two things together, a very powerful system emerges. You basically marry the real world, how the real world functions, into search. And that search is more relevant because we can bring to you experts, and sometimes experts and friends you may know, who may know something about what you want to know. And that's a much better system than it is today. With Google Plus, we would indeed, Google Plus has been a very successful system. We are very excited about it. And with Google Plus, we have much more data on who you know and what they know, so that we can improve your search experience going forward.
Have you notched up the social dial a bit since it's launched?
We experiment all the time with numerous things.
It's early days, but I mean, it's pretty exciting
that's Google for
to look at the potential of how well this might work over time. So.
Okay, I'll squeeze in this last thing, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And also, because we also want to talk about some of the team building stuff, I want to catch you after the end of the Q&A, come back to you about some of the things that have helped you. You started as a team of 10 people around a ping pong table.
Yes.
And now you've got hundreds of people all over the place, and yet you still make it together. So we want some ideas on what people can take from that. But, Ben, you had mentioned a statistic when we were talking, something like 2 humans only agree on relevancy 80% of the time. And that, in fact, I think you had said this, maybe you said it, and that if it was a year later, and I showed you the same set of results that a year before you had rated, you'd only agree with yourself 80% of the time. So how do you know if you're relevant? I mean, you mentioned the humans and things that are out there, but can anybody know, and can we independently assess whether or not you're getting it right when you make these kinds of assumptions of this algo tweak will make everything better?
Yeah, no, let me go to a sports analogy.
Yes.
In soccer, you have tens of games in a season, and if you lose 2, you're out. In baseball, you have 160 plus games in a season, and winning or losing a single game isn't really going to determine whether you'll make it to the World Series. Just look at our Giants. And what we do is, by giving thousands of queries, and each query to multiple human beings, we can statistically measure the interhuman being agreement on relevance that you mentioned, which is around 80% in general. You know, I say this is relevant, with 80% probability he will say this is relevant. So we can measure that and incorporate that interhuman agreement into our deep scientific measurement that I've talked about. And once you know that, then you can bring up statistical tests to say, have I run enough samples through to definitively say with 95% confidence, things like t-tests and so on, that the new system is indeed better.
Does it skew a bit? Because you ask these people who are not experts on the things that they're searching for to tell you whether or not they think things are relevant. So.
But time and time again, this 80% statistics holds up. So for your query, I'm 80% accurate. Thus, for my query, you are 80% accurate. And just knowing that and incorporating it into our evaluation formula allows us to do the right thing.
And the live data actually we have huge volumes of live data, even when we do tiny experiments, right? And so there, you can really make use of strong statistical techniques to make sure you're getting the answer right. And there, the person who's looking has the real information need. And so you get to a much closer a good determination of whether they are being satisfied.
But I think the part that might frustrate you is Google has spent 10 years trying to figure out how to evaluate potential changes, but we haven't talked as much about that outside of Google. And so, you know, to have a third party to say the relevancy is better of this search engine or that search engine is really difficult. And unfortunately, a lot of people will do like 3 queries, and that'll say, oh, okay, I found my homepage, therefore this is the best search engine. And so there hasn't been as much rigor in the third-party analysis. A lot of it is reduced down to metrics about who happens to have more growth in queries this month or something like that.
Okay, we're going to go to the open Q&A, and I'm also going to ask you about where you think things will be in 5 years from now when we get to the end of that too. So I'll save like the last 5 minutes there. If you have a problem with ranking on Google, if you could move to this side of the room, and we'll get those questions to you. So we have our first question over here.
Okay. In the last year or two, I've seen more and more of what I'll call type ahead, where Google attempts to finish my typed query. And I think I've seen search ahead, where I actually get results, you know, before I've hit return. Can you comment on, you know, how that's worked from your perspective and where it's going?
Oh, yeah, so we started doing Google Autocomplete about 4 or 5 years ago. And the idea there is that we still think of the search process in terms of the time from you having an information need to the time you're seeing the information you want. And so Autocomplete actually helps you formulate the query, because if you get the query formulation wrong, if you've got a spelling mistake, if you've got the wrong words, it's very hard for you to get into the right information, right? So Autocomplete was the first step in helping you formulate your query and essentially greasing the rails to your answer. Now, the second step is the best way you can evaluate whether this is the right query is if you can see the results. So our idea behind Google Instant was to begin to show you the results as you type. So you can begin to evaluate whether your partial query is what you wanted. And we find that like people get relevant results well before they've finished, several seconds before they finish typing their query. And so we are seeing like a lot of benefit to users from actually showing them results early. And we've been very, very pleased with sort of the impact it has on the time it takes for users to get the information they want.
Ben is being modest. He led Google Instant. And Google Instant has been a huge success for us. We are very proud of what we have done there.
Yeah. And in fact, Google kind of obsesses about speed to the point where we just launched something where if we really think it's likely that you'll click on the #1 result, then we might pre-fetch that, pre-render it. So by the time you click on that result, it shows up instantly. You don't even have to wait for that to download. So there's hundreds of people at Google thinking about every aspect of the search session and how can we like give you bionic arms to search faster and bionic brains and all this sort of stuff. And the goal is to get you to what you want as quickly as possible.
Yeah, they didn't buy my Google helmet idea with electrodes.
One day.
Next question.
Setting aside what you've done to earn your success over the years, day to day in your development work, how does it affect you knowing the competition authorities around the world, including the FTC, may well be, and in fact are, looking over your shoulders, and knowing how expensive and time-consuming that can be for the company, how damaging to the reputation
Yeah, that's a great question. I think having worked at the company for 10, 11 plus years, the core essence, the principles of the company have remained the same because it's almost like Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And I like to think that we've operated with the idea that someone could be watching over our shoulder and tried to make the right decisions all along. Now, you're right, it can be a roll of the dice. And so some of the things that we've been doing are trying to educate people how does search work? You know, what are the different policies? So, for example, we've made over 450 different videos that talk about common questions and answers. And if we can do a good job of explaining, yeah, there is some manual stuff whenever there's spam, but the vast majority of it is algorithmic, and explain how these are best practices and how every search engine does them to some degree, then hopefully that decreases the odds that there will be some miscommunication and some fluke will result in a problem. We have a very good legal team, and they think a lot about all of these issues. But I like to think that the core values at Google are such that we try to behave as if we were the underdog. We try to figure out how can you step into the other person's shoes. So how can you have a good appeal process? How can you scale up on communicating? How can you scale up on transparency and communication? But you have to be mindful that, you know, as an engineering company, we always have to have the idea that we can be wrong. We are a very disruptive company in a very disruptive space, which is technology. And so you have to be mindful of that responsibility. And if there are people who have suggestions for ways to improve, you absolutely want to be open to that and listen to that, whether that's someone you meet at a conference, someone who's tweeting to you, or whether it's someone who's a regulator.
Next question.
Hi. Oh, whoa. I had a question about what you do to deal with, like, the quote-unquote bad guys. Like, for instance, I understand searches are like generated as a result of an algorithm. But like, for instance, JCPenney, I guess a couple of months ago, that New York Times article about like how it kind of gamed the system. Like, what did you do to affect their rankings, and like what can a company like JCPenney do to kind of gain in the rankings afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the Googlers who worked on that exact thing are a couple tables away from you, as a matter of fact, right now. So for people who didn't read the New York Times story, this was JCPenney had engaged an SEO company, a search engine optimization company, and there are certain things that Google prefers not to see in our search results. So if you are buying links that pass PageRank, it's almost like a form of payola. It's like you're paying someone to say nice things about you, but you're just paying them to link to you. And so that's something that's against our guidelines, just like you're not allowed to do payola on the radio. And so whenever we see a violation of our guidelines like that, we are willing to take action. We absolutely try to write algorithms to spot that, counteract those links, diffuse and detect them so that they aren't an issue in the first place. And strangely enough, we'd already detected those links several times. I think if there was a failure in that particular case, it was that we didn't escalate and take stronger action earlier. But then the flip side is, once the company tries to clean things up, and JCPenney did a very good job of trying to make sure that they were doing ethical search engine optimization after that incident happened, then you have to make allowances and say, okay, how do we let you back into the search results? And at all times, the goal is to try to make sure that you're ranking appropriately in the search results. So it is a tricky problem in that in some cases, judgment does come into play whenever you're looking at violations of our guidelines. But the vast, vast majority of the time, you want those to be handled with the computer programs, with the algorithms, so that you don't have to bring that judgment into play.
Our goal in general is to reflect the real authority of a website. The goal of search in general. It's not to be ahead or behind it. Mm-hmm. And when somebody is trying to game the system to be either ahead of their real authority in the world, that's when we have to take action.
Next question.
Thank you all for a great panel so far. Ben Parr of Mashable. So you had this product, this cool product called Google Real-Time Search, where you could be searching, getting real-time updates and feeds through Twitter, Facebook, etc. Then the Twitter deal expired and it disappeared. And this is a question from my Google Plus audience, by the way. So the question is, when or if is Google Real-Time Search coming back? And do you need Twitter for that, or is that going to come primarily from Google Plus data?
So what Ben is referring to is we launched real-time search based upon data from various real-time data generation, information generation systems like Twitter, Facebook fan pages, and so on. And our deal with Twitter expired. We didn't come to an agreement. And after that, we decided that the value that product was providing was not enough for our users, and we took it offline. And we are actively working on, as we speak, figuring out, using our current G+ data and other sources that are out there, to revive the same functionality into Google search results. So I could say stay tuned. We are working hard on it.
Well, why didn't we get, and why don't we have now just the ability to search Google+? I mean, you're a search company, and we don't have the ability to search your own social network.
Your feedback is very well taken, Danny. Believe me. Again, we are on it.
Yeah. We are always thinking.
It's fair to assume there's always lots of things we want to do and a finite amount of people. So,
next question.
So with the addition of +1 search results, does this offer a new way to game the system where people can +1 and +1 and get their search results to the top, or how does that work?
Yeah, you can buy those now. I've read
not to
somewhere.
be cynical, but every change in search involves a potential way to game the system. I've gotten a little jaded over the years. But the thing that's actually nice is, if you think about ranking as it existed a few years ago, it was primarily based on links, anchor text, what's on the page. So, you know, we have over 200 different signals. The idea that the web might move from anonymous pages in some dark corner where you don't really know who wrote what, to a web where you actually do have some sort of annotation that says, this person wrote this, or this person vouched for this page. And you can have the reputation of individual people or authors. So if someone who's a New York Times columnist shows up on a forum and leaves a 2-line reply, that can be really important even if nobody links to it. So it's absolutely the case that people will try to game social signals, Google+, all of these things. You already see people trying to sell, you know, +1s. But there's different ways where you have new signals and different ways to intersect that and hopefully prevent that. And the idea that you can get a big win from all of these potential new signals is absolutely worth giving it a try. So,
and no signal is used in its absolute form. Every signal in its absolute form has its shortcomings, like you mentioned for +1. We cross hundreds of signals to build what's Google today.
yeah. You can certainly imagine having fun like, oh, we'll buy some +1s and then see what shows up. And then, you know, you can play games like that. So.
The +1 data right now, it is used as a ranking signal for when you're logged in, correct?
When you're logged in, it is a social signal if someone you know has vouched for something.
Okay.
Indeed, it's part of our social signal.
And if you're logged out, is it being used as one of many signals?
We are experimenting with numerous things always.
Which is Google speak for yes.
So my question comes from the standpoint of image and video searches. So, you know, if I was to search for a moonlit beach, and if the images or the video wasn't tagged with those specific words, are you guys doing some advance the art of video and image search, which can get me moonlit beaches without those words being there?
So our image search algorithm is far more sophisticated than just looking for those words either in the caption or nearby on the web page. There's a lot of computer vision technology built into our image search algorithm. Some of the team members are here today, which basically use those images to say, hey, this one looks like a beach and so does this one. And now you have a positive loop. You can find some great images of beaches, and then you can find some other images of beaches that didn't really say beach or didn't say beach with the same density as our algorithms would have liked. So it's a good question. We use a lot of that technology. It works very well, and we're constantly improving it. As you saw with our most recent launch of search by image, an image comes to you, you say, oh, what's that? You just drop it into Google image search, and guess what? With very high likelihood, we'll find it for you what you're looking at, using the same vision algorithms.
Next question.
Hey, I come from the mobile industry, and I'm sure that mobile phones have different kinds of search queries. I'd be interested in a comment on that. But the next thing that we think is coming is machine-to-machine mobile communication, and I'm wondering if you're preparing for machines to be generating queries in that way, and do you think, how different do you think machine queries will be than people-generated queries?
Well, I think the first point is not actually that accurate. The mobile query stream is getting to be more and more like the web query stream. When it was a while back, it was different. When phones were really slow, when interfaces were not full web browsers, the query stream was very different. But today, it's gradually approaching exactly the same distribution as the desktop query stream. And so to answer that part of the question, I think actually the things are much more similar than you think.
Yeah, and let me also add to that part of the question, with the innovations that we have made at Google with things like voice search, where it's hard to type on a mobile phone, so we gave you voice search, amazingly accurate voice search, and we start seeing human beings behaving the same way as they behave on desktop. I would say that on mobile devices, we still get somewhat more local-oriented queries, what's near me. And for that, we have launched numerous innovations, like on Google's homepage itself. There's a list of hot things you can do. There's like restaurants, coffee shops, and so on and so forth. So mobile query stream is actually reflecting what users need, which means it's coming closer to the natural distribution of queries. And mobile has been a great success for Google with all the innovations that the search team has made in mobile, not only by voice search, but things like our buttons are more touchable on a mobile interface. Our maps are far more designed for this tiny interface. We have done immense amount of work on mobile, and that reflects in our success in mobile. Now, the question about machine-to-machine searching right now, we haven't observed that much of it happening. And I think once that system picks up, we would have to analyze how that looks. But in an ideal world of search for me, search would be so accurate that you can just type a query and the machine should assume that the search engine, the other machine, would answer it correctly and then build a whole ecosystem on top of that platform. And that's our dream platform that we are building together.
Next question.
This may be a follow-up on the bionic arm question or a comment there, which is, you know, I've heard people in Google talk about searchless search, which I interpret to mean that maybe you can even take the personalization to the extent of anticipating what the user might want without even typing a query. So I'm curious about your points of view on that, and what are the challenges that poses to you?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because this kind of technology is what we as kids dream of, right? A computer would tell you what to do. And the truth
maybe not
is,
tell you what to do, but help
suggest.
you understand what might be possible, maybe.
And the truth is, first of all, right, you can see that in a future that's possible based on pieces that we already have, you can build systems where a computer can help you tremendously in making you a far more efficient human being. So, my phone already has my calendar. It knows when I'm free. It has my to-do list, which says I have to buy a baseball mitt. And it has a map based on Google Local of all the places that sell. And it knows where I am. So it's not too far out there that you can imagine that computer can gently prompt me, hey, please do pick a baseball mitt. You are 3 minutes away from Sports Authority right there, and you have 30 minutes free on your calendar.
And by the way, it's kind of annoying I have to have, yes, it would be nice. It's kind of annoying that I have to have a to-do list at all, right? Because Google has announced something called Google Wallet. And wouldn't it be great if you could go to the grocery store and you could buy things with your Google Wallet? All you do is you tap to pay. And then over time, if you wanted to and gave permission, Google could say, oh, you haven't bought cat food for 6 weeks. Normally you bought it every 4 weeks. Do you want to just add cat food to the list? Right? And then finally I don't have to think about, oh, I need A1 or I'm out of salad dressing or whatever. Like all these little traces we leave, if you're willing to opt in for those kinds of things, Google could be the little tap on your shoulder that's like, hey, don't forget to get wet cat food or something like that.
And the key there is that users have to opt into these things. It's a critical aspect. I'm a human being who deeply cares about my privacy. And that's the key part. Everything we do at Google, we think about that. Sometimes we get it wrong. We stand up, apologize, and move on. But that's how these systems and technology will evolve. If someone told me 20 years back that you would type into some machine, what's the height of Mount Everest, and it'll spit out an answer, I'll go, you're smoking crack, buddy. Go off that. Right? But see, what's possible with technology, we all have to dream it together and then build it in a privacy-preserving way.
If only you guys could answer our email, that would be a real solution. But next question.
Brian Fox, Western Union. First of all, Google has to know that my cat died last week because I blogged it, and you shouldn't send me that. That'll be your job. I'm curious about your vision, your image recognition technology. Do you use the power of the people doing the queries when they confirm that the beach really was what they were looking for? Does that loop back into your algorithm and improve its intelligence?
Numerous factors go into deciding in image search what images are most relevant and most liked by users. And there is that positive loop that based on users' choices of what we return, we can improve the system going forward. So when you combine the power of our search algorithm based on words with the power of vision algorithm and this wonderful loop, that's when you get what's Google Great Image Search today.
Lauren Chode, also with Western Union. We're a 160-year-old company, and I'm intrigued with the dichotomy of culture, which I care about. So you're obsessed with statistics and algorithms, and yet you talk about glass walls and the power of being 1 minute away from each other and being physically co-located. Can you talk about that in this global world and web and blah, 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 all that stuff? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been enormously helpful to be very close to the relevant people. And Google has offices around the world. And so, for example, numerous people in our office will have a video conference unit right there where the glass wall, they can look behind them, or they can look through the glass screen and talk to someone in New York. And so with very little work, it's easy to bring up somebody and collaborate from Tel Aviv, from New York, from Zurich. And that makes a huge difference. You know, you always have time zones, but just being able to have that face-to-face connection makes a huge difference. You know, short-circuit an email conversation, hop into some sort of face-to-face communication. It really saves a lot of time and a lot of misunderstandings.
Yeah, and we have found this proximity of teams, it makes us tremendously efficient. We can churn out things, as Danny pointed out, in one case, in 5 days, we could launch an algorithmic change at this scale. And this proximity doesn't always have to be physical. And by video conferencing, and in our office, there are like 2 or 3 video conferencing units that are open to the world all the time. And people can just say, hey, can you unmute? I need to talk to you. And there we go. We have a conversation.
And I think in the history of Google, we went through periods where we were very densely packed. But we also found, and that was not by design, it was just that we hadn't gotten more space, but we also found those were extremely efficient periods in the company, where people were packed into an office and they communicated a lot more than they otherwise would have. It might not have been their first choice based on their background. Many people came from backgrounds where you had your own office and so on. But it created a kind of energy that I don't think arises otherwise without that kind of density.
Yeah, there are some companies where every developer has their own office, whereas Ben, there was one office that had 3 bins in it, and so they called it the Ben Pen, right?
Yeah.
But it really does make a difference to be able to just turn around, and we have all these queues, right? You can do heavy-duty video conferencing. You can do a Hangout in Google Plus now. You can do Google Chat. And there's these cues that are subtle that are like, well, I'm red, but you can interrupt me if it's really, really important, all the way down to email and meetings and those sorts of things. So having that spectrum to be able to choose what's best to get in touch with someone, whether it's something that's a quick hit, 20 seconds, or a half-hour meeting, that really makes a big difference in terms of being able to collaborate.
In the early days, we used to say we pack them tight and give them deodorant. And that's how it works.
And we've got time for one more question.
So, Shailesh from Citrix. Thanks to the panel for wonderful insights into the search. So my question is about when I do my search, most of the times I get results back saying that 20,000 results in 2 seconds or so. But thanks to your excellent algorithms and principles, first 2-3 links I get my results many times. So why bother spending time for finding and searching for the 19,000 plus results and giving it to us? Can't you save time there?
Now, so you have seen that number sometime appear on Google's result page that says we have 20,000 or 200,000 results. But the truth indeed is what Shailesh said, that if you haven't found what you're looking for in the top 2 or 3 results, which shouldn't happen that often, or you can send us mail, then really going down further is not that useful. It's just that our algorithms do compute numbers for all those results. And so we give the user an indication of how much there is, but that doesn't mean you have to read 20,000 and feel pained about that.
I think in some ways it's a historic artifact. There was a time when, like, when you did a misspelling, you would get much fewer results in the real query, right? And so people used to use it as an indicator. It's no longer true today. We correct your spelling and so on, but it's a historic artifact that has, I think, a little bit of nostalgic value for us too.
And by the way, I'll give you one tip, which is that it is an estimate. It's not an exact count.
Yeah.
So if you ever notice, we only give 3 significant digits when we guess how many results there are. That's a little cue to let you know it's not really 982,000. It's roughly 982,000. So.
And I'm grimacing because I know I can still do a search where I should be getting a smaller number, but I actually get a bigger number.
Right.
So.
It's a rough estimate.
The last 2 things, I want to come back to the team aspect. So, you've talked a little bit about it already with the you can network or whatever, but
yeah,
there's
one metaphor that Amit mentioned, which is the baseball metaphor, which is when you've worked together for so many years, it's almost like having that many games in a season. You don't get that frustrated if you lose one time or if somebody tells you to go back to the drawing board. Because I remember whenever I launched Safe Search, this porn filter, the first time, I was all ready to go. I was all ready to flip the switch. And 2 engineers tested it out and said, you have too much stuff labeled as porn that isn't really porn. And I had to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to make it better. And at the time, I was kind of frustrated about that. But over the course of doing many launches, you build up that trust to where you say, this person's looking out for the best interests of the user. This person's looking out for the best interests of Google. So take that as constructive feedback. Don't get so caught up in one particular battle, one particular controversy, because it's guaranteed tomorrow there will be a new controversy, a new point of discussion. And that's helped a lot in making things more collegial.
Yeah, and now I look back at my 10 years of being part of this group. We started around a ping pong table with 10 people. Now we have hundreds of people in our group. And unwittingly somewhere, we developed a principle that has made this team out-innovate every other team out there. And that principle was, I would put leaders in place who I respect technically. So the entire management hierarchy of the group is built of people like ourselves who were engineers, wrote code, can understand what an engineer is going through, their happiness, their pain. The entire group hierarchy is built from people who have worked in the group for many years. Hundreds of people report to us now, but everyone who reports to us has managers who have been there many years. The whole group leadership is built of purely technical people with deep technical knowledge about search and deep understanding of what goes into this innovation machine that is Google. And that we just put in place early on because I couldn't find enough people to manage people as the group was growing. So I said, why don't, Matt, you manage 10 people. Okay, so Matt got 10 people, and then Ben, you managed 20 people. And that's how we grew the group. And it has served us very well. This is a lesson in leadership that we have all learned in retrospect. We weren't designing for this, but it so happened that if you are in the innovation space, you need to make sure that your leaders are so technical that everyone that works for those leaders respects them as technical people. And that has worked very well.
And I think all our leaders all stay with technical titles, and they think of themselves as first and foremost engineers, as we do too, right? Even though they do a lot of management and so on, their self-perception is as technical engineers.
Can I just say, by the way, your title is
software
senior.
engineer.
Are you senior, or are you just still
principal?
Principal engineer.
And your title is
Google Fellow.
And your title is?
My title is also Google Fellow.
Which pretty much has nothing to do with what you actually do.
But at Google, you can get anything you want printed on your business card. Literally, they do not care. There have been some pretty crazy business cards printed, right? Because titles are kind of, at least at Google, they don't make as much sense to obsess about, right? And so if you can get whatever you want on your business card, then you don't fixate, you don't obsess about it. You worry more about the job at hand, and that tends to work well.
And then in a tweetable or Google Plusable or Facebookable short statement, where are we at in 5 years from now, other than bionic arms doing all of our searches?
So, all of us have our views of where we want to head 5 years from now. I was raised on a healthy dose of Star Trek, and I want my Star Trek computer. Okay, that's what I want in 5 years from now. I should be able to talk to it, ask it whatever, and it should be able to have a conversation with me. And search is, of course, fundamental to that.
I want Star Trek in 5 years, but in 1 year, I want the ability to get reminded that I need to get cat food while I'm on the way home. And also the ability, Google voice recognition has gotten very good, and it can't be that much harder to make a well-punctuated email. So I want to be able to do my email while I'm driving home, I'm talking maybe at a stoplight or whatever, and have it look as if I have very carefully crafted it by typing. That can't be that hard of a problem. That shouldn't even be a 3-year problem, right? So I'll go back and file a bug when I get back.
Yeah, I think I share Amit's vision of the Star Trek computer, but I think in the shorter time frame, I want the search on my phone, which is with me all the time, to work really, really smoothly and effortlessly. And it's not quite there yet. It's gotten a whole lot better, right? You started, voice recognition is getting there, translation is getting there. You can now do these amazing things, right? Like you can take a photograph. I was in South America recently, and I was at a restaurant with Spanish menus, right? I took a photograph of the menu, and with image recognition and translation, I could then translate the menu into English. I was like, wow, that's amazing. And it's sort of you can sort of see where you're going to go, but you're not there yet. And I want that reality to become, completely fluid, completely reliable, so that people all over the world can actually, communicate and get information really easily. And I think this matters not just here, but particularly in other parts of the world where people don't have as easy access to information, right? Where people in India and people in Africa and people in the third world really have access to this information the way that we take for granted in many ways today. And they have access, and I think that will empower their lives, and I think that will change the world in many ways.
So let me communicate our enthusiasm for search by saying, I feel like a kid going to candy store every morning, and you haven't seen nothing yet.
Yep. Cool. Well, it sounds like all search in the future will be mobile, and we won't even be searching. It'll be happening for us. So thank you all very much for being here. It's really been a delight. I wish I had another 3 hours to keep going at it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So on behalf of the Churchill Club and our audience, thank you again, Ben, Matt, and Amit, and of course Danny for spending this evening with us. This has been a memorable and inspiring experience, I think, for most of us here. We love your authenticity and your freely sharing your thoughts and perspectives. So as a symbol of our thanks, we're pleased to present you with your very own comfortable, washable, yet highly fashionable Churchill Club t-shirt.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Please wear it proudly, and I hope that you remember fondly your evening here on the Churchill Club stage. And you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much for coming. Drive safely. Good night.